Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Kathy. I didn't notice who was wearing green. I'm just getting my timer on. So I tried to do two impossible things when Kathy and Glenn and Subhathri approached me. One was to try and get all economists together in a room at the speed of light with my fading memory. And so as the event started unfolding, I got these emails from people saying, what about me, what about me? So I think we've gotten there. So my apologies if I've forgotten anybody, and I'm sure I've forgotten you. And if you're not on the program, doesn't mean that you don't have anything good things to say. It just means, like Dave Kaplan, you came from Paris, and we're really worried that you about things other than economics. But the second impossible thing I've tried to do here is to try and summarize. I gave myself a challenge, and my panelists from the President's Advisory Council know this, and have heard me present this. I set myself a challenge of trying to describe South Africa's long-run growth challenges in 5 slides. So you can imagine as an academic how difficult that is. So what I'm going to do really is to give you what I've called 5 key long-run growth concerns for South Africa. These are, let me be very clear and defensive up front, these are my 5 concerns. I'm sure you've got 5 much better ones. I'm sure there's 7 that I've missed, and there are 3 where the nuance is wrong. But I'm hoping that through these 5, they can and will define the broad intellectual or analytical or policy superstructure that will feed into the detailed session. So I really try to set this up as an entry point into the individual sessions, which frankly I think are far more interesting than this overview. So what are the 5 concerns? The first, right, and this data did astound me, and Tim Kohler, who's a junior researcher, did this data slide for me. This is South Africa's, this is a 40-year average, right? So close on 40 years of real GDP per capita growth since 1980 in a sample of middle-income countries. I don't think I have a pointer. Do I have a pointer? For South Africa's on the far right, if you can't see, and that's 0.29. So South Africa for 40 years, right, has been growing at 0.29% in real terms per year for close on the 40-year period. We are, and we've written about this before, but we are effectively the poster child for a middle-income country that's in a long-run growth trap. If you change the period, so let's change the data period and go post-94, so that we have perhaps a more realistic assessment of, thank you, so that's South Africa over there, a more realistic assessment of growth. The estimate is 2.5%. So even then, with a sample of middle-income countries, if you show the graphic for the post-94 period, we're right at the bottom. The laggards in the group change. So with the post-94 period, they sort of Brazil, Turkey, Indonesia, depending on the time period, Russia. In our case here, the bottom 10, these economies to the right have not recorded growth of more than 1%, include Kenya, Mexico, Nigeria. But our immediate neighbors, let's be clear, are Venezuela, Ukraine, Nigeria, and Mexico. So in many ways, we serve, and that for me is the ultimate challenge, right, is how you think about it. The ultimate concern is how do you think about undoing what is effectively a long-run economic growth trap that we're in. If you want to do that, you've got to be to the left of the sample, and you all know who's right on the top. But right next to China, right? So if you're a betting person, put your money on Vietnam, right? Vietnam's growth rates are close to 5%. They've been that for 40 years on average. Some of the detail, because you know this data, some of the detail is important. One factual piece of information around the first big concern is that our rates of return on investment, at least for the period that we looked at, not this period, the post-94 period, our rates of return on investment are the same as China. I'll say that again. The rates of return on investment on average are the same as China's. Must therefore mean that everything you see on this board, the micro constraints, to investment are what deter, right, investors, particularly foreign investors, from greater investment in the economy. So the levels, percentage of GDP levels, of course, for South Africa, investment as a share of GDP are much lower than that of China. The second concern, and I'll lead in before I show you the graphic, the second concern is that astride this sort of long-run economic growth track is that we've, all successful industrializers thus far, and people in this room, some of you know much more about this than I do, have succeeded in industrializing, moving from low to middle to high-income country status from Taiwan or from Japan to Taiwan and now China, have done that through low-wage manufacturing or labor-intensive manufacturing or manufacturing. Manufacturing sits as the lifeblood of a long-run growth trajectory. It sits as the lifeblood of industrialization. Yet what we've seen in South Africa, and that's the second key concern, and I promise you I'll explain the graphic, is the notion of premature deindustrialization. And again, this is a concern around the developing world where you've seen economies' manufacturing capacity, manufacturing share of GDP stall. So manufacturing as a share of GDP has stabilized, but stabilized in a bad way for South Africa. What's supposed to be happening as you push through middle-income country status, like China, is that manufacturing share of GDP should be growing, and that's where you get these urban wage jobs from. That's not happening in South Africa. Thankfully, at least, we're not alone. So there are a variety of countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, where manufacturing has stabilized, or if you like, flatlined. What that has led to is the view in this global literature of the notion of premature deindustrialization. Now I'm using, the specifics, let me just be clear before I get to the complexity graph. Mining was 15% of GDP, it's now 8%. Agriculture is down, but the key for our purposes here is that manufacturing has declined by 13 percentage points as a share of GDP. Why do I have, and I don't have time to explain the complexity graph, this is a sort of a Hausman notion of how you think about product exports. Everything that's colored is what we export. What it suggests, where it's colored and the large size, suggests certainly an economy that's export-based is still primary commodities-based. But over time, what you have seen, and I've got your agro-processing and horticulture and chemicals, for example, you have seen elements of growth in specific, if you like, classically non-manufacturing sectors. So I want to argue very tentatively, as a latecomer to this literature, that perhaps we don't have maybe premature deindustrialization, possibly delayed or stalled industrialization, because you're certainly seeing elements of industrialization in terms of horticulture, agro-processing, and so on. That for me is a debate worth having throughout the next 2 days, which is, have we seen a rapid premature deindustrialization, and if so, what does that suggest about the future of manufacturing? And I know people in the room have written wonderful pieces on this. But the third key fact, which actually feeds off on the second fact, is that we are now de facto, and in terms of the data, very clearly a services sector, right? Close on 70%, it will show in the next slide, 70% of GDP is now accounted for by the services sector. You know this data, most of you, right? But essentially what we've seen, I'll talk a little bit about services, but it's a replication of what I said earlier. Mining share of GDP collapses for lots of other non-economic reasons. Construction, agriculture should be, agriculture has declined, and the rest of the growth has actually been in the services sectors. Let me give you the actual figures. The 4 sectors driving economic growth post-94 period are essentially services sectors. If we just look at shares of GDP, you've got transport, storage and communication, financial and business services, construction, and of course wholesale and retail trade. The remaining 5 sectors all declined. If you aggregate the services sectors, they account for, and it depends on the time period, sometimes you get 65, sometimes you get 71, but essentially you've got 2/3 of this economy is now accounted for by services sectors. Let me just caution, right? that when we say services, the literature tends to aggregate. There's some now, as we're thinking about services, there's more and more work being done. Danny Roderick's talking about services as a ladder for sub-Saharan Africa instead of manufacturing. We have to start disaggregating. So my simplistic notion, again in the limited time I have, is that there are 4 big categories of services that we have to keep in mind. The first is the high productivity services sector that we think of, financial and business services, fintech and that sort of thing. The second, perhaps less mentioned in the literature, comes out of this formal services sector, but it's the semi-skilled services sector. And I want to argue, and I'd like to debate this in the individual sessions, that this is perhaps where South Africa needs to be thinking more clearly about services-based employment. Semi-skilled services employment is the BPOs. It's the call centers, right? Intensive in the use of semi-skilled labor. The third and fourth components of the services sector that always come up, particularly in developing country data, first is low productivity services jobs, which is another phrase for the informal sector, right? So the informal sector is often captured, well, services are growing in, if you see these sort of sub-Saharan African aggregates, services is growing. Well, actually it's urban, informal employment. The fourth category is, of course, the public sector. And so I would argue that no growth trajectory can depend on the growth in public sector employment. And so in essence, the game is on about the first 3, in particular the third as an avenue for first-time employment. But that's something to discuss later. So that's the third fact. So I'm almost there, right? The fourth fact, right, and going back to my roots, is, and it's a very carefully titled slide, is not jobless growth. We've had an economy that's insufficient in terms of employment creation. And let me just be clear about that. So if we take the period 2009, so it's about a 10-year period, right? Employment over this period, if you focus on the second last column, employment over this period has grown by about 2 million jobs. That's very important. We haven't seen a collapse in employment. We've actually seen employment growth. What's your problem? Your problem is the growth in the labor force. The labor force has grown by more than double that. That's your problem. So it's insufficient employment creation. You've got too many new work seekers relative to the economy's ability to generate those jobs. We are generating jobs, but an insufficient number. How can we think about that in more simple terms? Well, one way is that the annualized percentage change of employment is 1.3%, but the labor force has grown by 2.1, let's make. That ratio, right? Let me hold on to that ratio. The target growth rate for me is really important. The target growth rate answers the following question. It says, if I wanted to give everybody, every new work seeker from 2009 a job, by how much should employment have grown? And the answer is 3%, not 1.3. And so the target growth rate is a really important, at least, instrument that we use in sort of the DPRU type work regularly with these labor market updates is, are we hitting the target growth rate? So how far off are we in terms of at least keeping unemployment at its steady state in the base year? It's not even reducing unemployment to 0, because that figure is huge, right? So how badly are we doing? That's that figure right at the bottom. For every new work seeker, for every 100 new work seekers into the labor market, only 46 out of the 100 are actually getting a job. And that's really a sense in which, if you like, the huge socioeconomic challenge that we face is crystallized in the employment challenge figure. So, and I'm glad to say I think I've even saved the organizers some time. So maybe I should take much longer on the final slide. The final slide is one, I think some of you have heard me sort of beat this drum, and I think you know what I'm going to say next almost, certainly, right? So we've focused quite heavily in the poverty and inequality literature, or at least in the survey data literature, on how unequal the society is. So the standard response is this is the most unequal society in the world. The Gini coefficient is 0.63. If you take wage income, it's 0.7. If you take investment income, it's 0.98. All sorts of things. Decompose, but we're the most unequal society in the world. So what I want to show you next is a graphic of wage growth, right? Wage growth over the percentiles of the distribution. So from the lowest earner to the highest earner, right? Over the last 20 odd years, what has wage growth looked like? And this, I want to suggest, is a really important change in the way that we need to think about inequality. And it's the notion of the missing middle. So what we see is a stark picture of how wages and wage growth have changed across the distribution. And here I've got the 2000 to 2015 period. So effectively what I have is wage percentile. So these are only the wage employed, right? And average annual growth rates across the distribution. And it's a stark picture of the missing middle. So the northern literature is very clear. You've got this hollowing out of the middle of the distribution. That's Europe and North America and so on. And they're all this sort of, how tasks are being replaced, how jobs are being outsourced to China and Mexico. There's that whole literature. So all we did was say, well, what's going on in South Africa? And we did not expect to see this. We really did not expect to see a hollowing out of the middle of the distribution. So let me give you some of the numbers and then talk about quickly to end off the econometrics that comes with it. Some of the numbers. So who are these people? Because we always get this question, like who's in here and how many people and so on. I don't have all the details, but I have them in my back pocket for you later. So these are the percentiles, the first to the 35th, so that's the missing middle, and then above the 75th. You've got 5 million people, more or less. 4.7 million wage earners in the middle of the distribution. This is not an insignificant number, right? 5 million, which constitutes 36% of all wage earners, right, in South Africa's labour market have seen a deterioration in their wages. I'll talk a little bit about what I think may be driving that and what pressures are going on. The data, so at the bottom you've only got 4.4 million and then 3.8 million at the top end. Who are these workers? In the middle of the distribution, let me just quickly tell you, it's a mixture. It's a smorgasbord of domestic and farm workers who are also at the bottom end. It's taxi drivers, right? There are a million union workers. So I've got the union figures as well. So you've got a million union workers in the middle of the distribution, 500,000 in the bottom, and 1.5 million from the 70th percentile upwards. Effectively, you've got a mixture of South Africa's middle of the distribution, right, sitting there that have seen a deterioration in their wages. What's driving it? The econometric evidence. So when people get nervous with this, because it's just a figure, right? The econometric evidence, if you want to know about recentered influence functions, we can tell you about that. We've got 4 frameworks very quickly. Education, right? Returns to education have declined. If you're in high school or a TVET qualification, those returns have declined if you're in the middle of the distribution. You're getting a high school diploma, but your returns have actually gone down, right? Either because you're not getting a job, or when you get a job, your returns are declining. The second key explanation is the changing sectoral composition of employment. The collapse of manufacturing and mining has seen medium-skilled jobs disappear, right? The third is more in keeping with the international literature, is what is called this sort of task-based changes. What you're seeing is that the middle of the distribution is intensive in these medium skills, what we call the blue-collar workers. If you're a blue-collar worker in a factory, you're doing repetitive type tasks. You're packing things in boxes, right? Those jobs have been lost. And the data shows that. The econometric evidence shows that very clearly. The final explanation is to do with institutions. So the bottom of the distribution have been heavily helped by minimum wages, and the middle have lost out relative to the top and the bottom, given how, I would argue, we've bargained for wages thinking about pay gaps as extremities and forgotten about the middle of the distribution. So one final point about the missing middle, instinctively, we've got some very early evidence, but instinctively it suggests to me that this is not just a missing middle in terms of a data sense, but people who have inflation baskets given their consumption items. So the urban working class are consuming education, health, housing, energy, water, far more intensively than, say, food, and certainly more than those at the bottom of the distribution. Those price indices are much higher than average inflation. So what you've got is a deterioration in the living standards of the poor. When we presented this to the president, he said that explains the e-toll strike. And in many ways, it crystallizes, I think, the new form of inequality in society. I'm going to stop there, but in essence, what I did try and do, if you like, is not at all, by any means, to summarize the really nuanced information and knowledge that you all have, but rather to give you broad brushstrokes of how we can think about the parameters within which we can have a better conversation over the next 2 days. Thanks very much.